ask that you pray with me as we begin today. Amazing Father, we are greatly blessed to know your amazing grace, to know that we are truly needful of grace and mercy from you, because we are people who have sinned and sin and will sin. And so, Father, we are certainly aware of the tremendous gift extended to us through the life and the death of Jesus Christ. And so, Father, each day we seek to draw closer to you, to live through your perspective, and to know that you understand us, that Jesus truly experienced human life as we have lived. We live it here in a different day and time when he walked this earth. But as people, we don't change. It's just the various things we have at our disposal are just different, but the same needs need to be met. The same human emotions are present. And so, dear God, we thank you for understanding, for ministering to us where we are. And Father, out of the abundance of that, we minister to others. And so we give you thanks. So we ask that you would speak to us through your word today. We know that your Spirit will intercede, bring things to our attention today. I just pray that we are good listeners, that you would help me to speak clearly. I pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Today we begin a new series as we open a new year together. We're calling it A Long Day, and you will find out why here in just a moment. But we'll be addressing this week, and then next week we will take a break because I'd like to set up the Dream Day for us next week. And hopefully you've had a chance. We've had the banner updated out in the hallway this week, and our guys did a great job of getting that put up there for us. So that is up to date information of what we've accomplished and where we are in our process. And just hope that you'll take a few moments as you're headed out the hallway this morning. And hopefully all of you will be signing up over here to come next Sunday. I can't express to you how important this time is for us and your involvement to be here with us, to share it with us. And whether you fully understand everything that's going to happen or not, I hope you do, and just realize it's going to be a significant day and that you'll plan to be here with us. So after that week, we will have 2 more weeks in this series, and we'll wrap that up. And again, I pray that God will, as he does, brings to our attention the things that we need the most. And that continues to happen over and over again in my life, and probably yours as well. We're in the 14th chapter of Matthew today, and we will be throughout this series. I was reading an article this past week that I've read before. I kind of stumble upon it every once in a while, and it's entitled Workplace Wisdom. And there are 38 statements that are there that reflect a lot of what has been said or thought or practiced in the work environment. And I'm not going to read all 38 to you this morning, though they're quite interesting, but I'd like to share several with you today. One of them says, I can only please one person per day. Today is not your day. Tomorrow doesn't look good either. Another one says, except that some days you are the pigeon and some days the statue. Another one says, on the keyboard of life, always keep one finger on the escape key. When you don't know what to do, walk fast and look worried. Another one says, if it wasn't for the last minute, nothing would get done. That's for all the procrastinators in the world. And another one, I don't suffer from stress, but I am a carrier. I don't suffer from stress, but I am a carrier. I've known some stress carriers, haven't you? And just people that kind of raise the tension in any group you're in, and it's not always a good thing. So we kind of all know those people. But you know, stress is a real issue for us. in a lot of different ways that it comes to us. We deal with it daily. And something I was reminded of when I was studying stress years ago was that not all stress is harmful to us. That a life completely absent of any stress, we wouldn't get a lot done. And, there's a certain level of stress in a lot of things that we are called upon to do. When you go to a new place for the first time, or you're asked to do a task that you've never done before, in your school, you go up into the next grade, you get a new job assignment. Anytime you do something new that may really help you and broaden you and help you to grow and challenge you to do so, there's always some stress involved in that. It just can't be avoided. I think if there was no stress, we'd be stressed about that. I mean, that's just kind of the way I think a lot of times we function. But stress is sometimes positive, and so it's kind of good to realize that is there as well. We deal with stress in a lot of ways. Some of us pray a lot harder when we feel stressed, and that's a good thing to do. We exercise. Some of those big muscle activities that are good to just relieve some of that stress tension that is within us. Talking with other people, sharing with people what you're going through. Letting them speak into your life as you vent and share what's going on in yours. And often just someone else's perspective a lot of times does some good for us, because we're just seeing things kind of in our laser focused way, and we're not seeing some peripheral things or some really large things sometimes that we're just missing in our scope. Other things that we do are reading the Bible. Some people just open the Bible and begin reading. That's certainly a good thing to do, and God will speak to us through that and help us. And there's certainly passages in the Bible that speak about stress and anxiety and worry, because it's a common human emotion that we have, and it's a feeling that we have. And so Bible does help in so many great ways. There's support groups today for things that are a larger challenge to us, and we find some help from people who are going through similar things. And, those can be quite helpful to us. There's therapy, seeing a doctor, just being a part of those kinds of things. And then there's medication. There's medications that we can take today that can kind of knock down stress levels, and sometimes we need that kind of help, and God works through that as well. And we also realize that some people deal with stress better than others. Maybe you're the person that seems like you're always churning, and you're with somebody else that just thinks just kind of, just kind of fly over their head. I was talking to one of our church members after the first service and talking about how different a husband and wife is. And he didn't worry about anything. She worried about everything. And, maybe those people gravitate together. I don't really know part of that positive, negative thing. Two different kinds of people that end up together. But there's just some people that deal with it more productively, and they just don't take it as personally and absorb it and really allow it to crunch them up on the inside. But sadly, it has affected our children as well. Kathy Walker, in her book, What's the Hurry, writes, these days it's assumed that kids are stressed from a young age and need help managing it. They're growing up with a sense of hurry in the air. They observe anxiety in the adults around them. They hear tension in our voices. It's their early inheritance. It kind of hurt, kind of broke my heart a little bit to read that last sentence. It's their early inheritance. I usually think of inheritance being something really, a difficult thing, a death probably experience that someone is really receiving a great gift from. When I read this, I didn't have any good feelings, about reading of what our children are dealing with, and I'm not surprised. It didn't surprise me at all. It'd help us all to get a better handle on the stress in our lives, and I don't know really of a better person to learn how to deal with it better than from Jesus. Matthew chapter 14 records what some have called the second most stressful day in Jesus' earthly life, topped only by the day he was crucified. In one 24-hour period, Jesus has a reason to cry, to praise, to run, to be frustrated, to be alone. And if you've ever had days when you felt like doing any or all of those, then this look at a very pressurized day in the life of Jesus can be very helpful to you. Something that came out in some of my reading this past week is one thing this day helps us to understand is that Jesus, God in the flesh, fully human, fully God, knows exactly what we feel. When we talk about stress, this isn't something He's foreign to. He understands stress. And we're going to talk about a day when He had a lot of it. I'm using a several point outline on the back of your bulletin this morning. The first one is that Jesus knows about stress when death comes. He knows about stress when death comes. Jesus begins this very difficult day early in the morning hearing about the death of John the Baptist. John was his cousin, so there's this relative connection, but he was also Jesus' friend. There is no one that understood the ministry of Jesus better than John the Baptist. John was the one who preceded him by several months. John was the one who prepared the way for him. He understood Jesus' mission. And he was one who was leading a little bit ahead of him, and he understood why Jesus was there. He was the one who baptized Jesus. And so this closeness that Jesus and John the Baptist experienced was very helpful and meaningful to both of them, but all of a sudden, John is dead. And I think all those same feelings that you and I have when someone significant to us dies are the very things that Jesus felt. And sitting here this morning, if you've had one of those significant losses, you remember exactly what you felt inside when that became a reality to you. And those same feelings are what Jesus was feeling as He began to grieve the loss of John the Baptist. And what made this even more painful was that John didn't die of natural causes. This wasn't something expected and, we're all waiting for a disease to run its course. Instead, we find John brutally murdered by decapitation. There's just something about different types of deaths that just kind of turn the knife another turn or two in our gut just because of how that death came about. And all of this brought tremendous grief to Jesus. He's feeling it to the soul of his being. And it hurts, just like it hurts us. But the messengers who came with this news didn't just bring that news. They also brought a warning. And their warning was this. Herod had been extremely obsessed with John the Baptist. If you read through the Gospels, you realize during that period, Herod was obsessed with John the Baptist. But that obsession has now moved to Jesus. Herod listened to John until John began condemning what he had done to acquire his current wife. And the confrontation of that and the strong words of condemnation that came because of what he had done, he had basically taken his brother's wife as his own. And the public knowledge of that became stronger as John continued to speak, to the point that Herod had him put in prison where that public voice was not heard. And the Bible tells us that he would often go down to John and speak to John in the prison, and he would listen to him preach, and no intention of changing his life, but he was intrigued by him and by his message. But now that attention is turned to Jesus. Luke tells us in the 9th chapter, beginning in verse 7, he said that when Herod Antipas, the ruler of Galilee, heard about everything Jesus was doing, he was puzzled. Some were saying that John the Baptist had been raised from the dead. Others thought Jesus was Elijah or one of the other prophets risen from the dead. I beheaded John, Herod said. So who is this man about whom I hear such stories? And he kept trying to see him. So there's grief. There's some warning of a threat. And we can realize that Herod wasn't looking for him to have some kind of friendly get-to-know-you conversation. And so with John's life taken, his own life threatened, Jesus says it's time to move somewhere else. But before he can get underway, the disciples return from their journey. That leads us to the second point today. Jesus knows about the stress when we receive mixed news. Mixed news. These 12 disciples Jesus has learned about the death of John. He's grieving, and while he is in this state of mind, the 12 disciples return from their first solo flight ministry journey. Jesus has sent them out, told them what to do, allowed them to do various miracles and so forth, and to open the way for the message and to give them validity in the eyes of people. And it's been a very successful trip. I mean, they are coming back and they just cannot wait to tell Jesus what they have been involved with. They're like a group of schoolboys that come running in the door after having a really neat experience, and they're all talking at once to the parents or whoever happens to be there to share with. They're all talking at once. They're laughing. They're poking at each other. They can't wait to tell Jesus what has happened to them. They want to tell him about the healings that they were able to do and the teaching that they were able to deliver to others. And we need to understand they're so excited because they're ordinary people like you and I. And they've never done anything like this. They watched Jesus do it, but they've never done it on their own. And they're so excited. And they just can't wait to tell him. You know, it's just like Peter saying, oh, did you see that the guy restored his sight back to him? I mean, it was so incredible. And his family was so overjoyed. And we stayed there for the whole night. And everybody in the town came and celebrated. Or maybe Andrew was saying, you know, that paralytic that I laid my hands on, he was able to get up and dance. And we had a great time together. And they're just constantly, you know, throwing things in, saying, Jesus, this happened. And Jesus, this happened. And I taught a group of people here, and they just gave such great attention to your message. And I think Jesus listened very attentively. I can just see a smile on his face as he is so excited to hear them talking about something that is preparing them for ministry much later on. And he's so happy that they are enjoying their success. But their conversation was interrupted by people coming from all over Judea and Galilee who have heard the horrible news about the death of John the Baptist. And they come to Jesus because they want to hear what he has to say about this. And the Zealots, a group that many of us know about, were a group that was ready to overthrow the government at a moment's notice because they were looking for a leader to guide them through this purge of government figures, of Roman government figures in their lives, and let them take over. And some of these zealots would have been very critical of Jesus for not intervening in the death of John the Baptist. Like, you know, you raised people from the dead. I mean, why didn't you go down there and stop Herod from taking John's life? I mean, you know, there could have been that kind of criticism in this group as well as those who are looking for new leadership to guide them in this purge of Roman government. And Jesus is feeling all these tensions. It's the death of John. It's the excitement of his disciples. And now there's all these people coming that are trying to push him towards something that he is not looking for. And so Jesus knew they needed some solitude. He and his disciples needed some time to themselves. They needed some careful instruction about what was going to be coming next. And they'd have unanswered questions about things that might have happened on this ministry trip they had just returned from. And they would have questions about John's murder. And so Jesus told his disciples to prepare a boat, and they were going to take a trip to the other side of the lake. And Jesus is envisioning, I think, this slow, quiet voyage across the water. Some time alone, away from the crowds. Some time to catch their breath. Some time to have some intimate conversation. Some time together. Some rest. And perhaps Jesus thought when they landed that there would be an opportunity for them to spend a quiet night alone and with his disciples after a very grueling day. And I can see wanting that. Don't you kind of look to, this is where this is going to end and I can go recuperate? I think that was a normal thing for Jesus as well. That leads us to the next point. Jesus knows about stress when your intentions are misunderstood. The crowd who watched the boat depart from the shoreline noticed which direction they were heading. And they watched just long enough to see, okay, they're on a trajectory this way. That means they're probably going to land in this place. And some of them began moving that way. Now, some of them were young and healthy and excited, and they ran probably the 6-mile journey around the northeastern shore of the Sea of Galilee, and they were probably there waiting when the boat began to come into view. There were others that probably walked over there. They wanted to be there when Jesus arrived, that they weren't quite in the mindset that they wanted to run over there, weren't able to do that. And I'm sure there were some that were there at that particular moment that decided not to go at all. Maybe they had some family business to take care of, who knows what. All that group probably didn't travel with them. But I think as that group began running and that group began walking over there, they were talking among themselves. I think as they saw people along the road, they began to say, hey, did you hear about John the Baptist? Jesus is on his way to such and such place. I mean, you want to come join us? And needless to say, Jesus was at the height of his popularity. And now that John the Baptist was dead, there were a lot of people who wondered what that meant for Jesus. Was it now time he was going to make his move? And so people were very excited to be where Jesus was. And as that boat came into view of Bethsaida, where they end up landing, where this crowd has already gathered to meet them, it was a large crowd. Matthew and Mark record in their Gospels that there were 5,000 men in this particular group at the time of feeding. But they also say this did not include women and children. And there's some that look at this number and we're thinking about who was probably there and can imagine this crowd being as large as 25,000. That's a lot of people. I mean, if it was 10,000, that'd be a lot of people. It's a lot of people. And they're there to meet Jesus. And Jesus might have crossed the sea to get away from the crowds. He needs to grieve. He needs to spend some relaxing time with his followers. He needs to hear some more of their stories. He's tired, but his compassion overcomes what he wanted. And so as he stepped off of the boat, he began healing those who needed healing. He began teaching, as he always did, about the kingdom. And he began moving further into this crowd, taking care of their needs. And all of a sudden, a very stressful thing began to develop for his disciples. Because they're hungry. They haven't eaten all day. The one time you would have expected them to eat, the crowds were too amassed around them, the Bible says. Mark tells us in his gospel that they couldn't eat. And so here's some guys that were past lunchtime, And they don't have anything to eat yet. Now, I don't know about you. If you get up in the morning and you don't eat anything after lunch, those days you have to go in for a lab, and you can't eat for so long. Or, you kind of understand that's kind of one of those times. But this is not one of those times for these guys. There's no time to eat. And so they're wandering around thinking, I'm getting kind of hungry. And, this is a pretty big crowd. And if Jesus doesn't dismiss this group pretty soon, what are we going to do? And so they decide to come to Jesus and say, Jesus, these people are going to eat soon. Why don't you dismiss them so they can go find something to eat? Matthew 14:14 says, when Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them and healed their sick. As evening approached, the disciples came to him and said, this is a remote place and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away so they can go to the villages and buy themselves some food. Jesus replied, they do not need to go away. You give them something to eat. You give them something to eat. I don't know if you can see the head jerk on all these guys when they kind of heard that and thought, say it again. It's kind of one of those, say it again. I didn't hear you right. Say it again. But when they heard this, rather than turning to Jesus and asking for his help, they check out their own pockets. I'm sure they pulled them out and there was nothing in their pockets, and they're kind of thinking, well, how in the world are we going to do this? Mark 6:37, but Jesus says, you feed them. With what? They asked. We'd have to work for months to earn enough money to buy food for all these people. Isn't that the first place as humans we normally look when we're called upon for something? We look at our own resources. And where our first thought is how limited they are or that they don't exist. That's exactly what they're doing. And they're stressed. At this point, they're really stressed because A, they're hungry. B, Jesus saying, you need to take care of this. And they're saying, don't have no. Okay? And they're struggling. And I can imagine as they're talking about money and how much money it takes to feed all this group, I can see Judas over there kind of tightening up his grip on their money bag. We know he was the treasurer of the group. We know he pilfered funds from that on occasion when he wanted them. John records that for us a little bit later in his gospel. And I can see Judas kind of moving that pouch a little further back in his cloak, making, I just assume we not get into this. I know they don't have that kind of money in there, but he's tight-fisted. He doesn't want to touch that. Jesus sends them out to go through the crowds and see what food anyone had. And they return empty-handed almost. If there's that many people there and all they came back with was a little boy's lunch, they're basically trying to say, Jesus, we looked and this is all there is. Sorry. Now, we told you. It's just not here. All we got is this little boy's lunch. Mark 6:38, Jesus said, how much bread do you have? Go and find out. They came back and reported, we have 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. If you read this, this is like 2 sardines and some little barley loaves. Just a little boy's lunch, okay? We're not talking about the big fish and chips dinner, you pick up somewhere. We're talking about a little boy's lunch. There's not a lot here. And they come to Jesus and say, well, here it is, Jesus. We did what you said. This is all there is. Sorry. We told you. Can you catch the irony of this situation? The disciples are telling the bread of life, there is no bread. If you're Jesus, you've been teaching these guys. You've been mentoring them. You've been taking care of their needs. They just got back from a great solo flight. They've done some neat stuff for the kingdom. And here they are telling Jesus, this is all we got, Jesus. We don't have anything else. I don't know if we can grasp really his feeling of being misunderstood. Guys, do you know who I am? You're coming to me and saying we don't have resources? You're telling me we don't have resources? Look at me. You know who I am. Matthew 14:18. Bring them here to me, he said. And he directed the people to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the people. They all ate and were satisfied. And the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. The number of those who ate was about 5,000 men, besides women and children. No food, huh? You know, Jesus could have taken that moment to kind of severely reprimand them for lack of faith, lack of perspective, misunderstanding him. But you know, Jesus gave the same compassion to them that he gave to the crowds, because they knew they were still learning. What followed again revealed that Jesus' intentions were misunderstood. In John 6:14, it says, when the people saw him do this miraculous sign, they exclaimed, "Surely he is the prophet we have been expecting." When Jesus saw that they were ready to force him to be their king, he slipped away into the hills by himself. Jesus knew what they wanted. They just wanted somebody to feed them, to distribute whatever they needed at a particular time. A bread Messiah, some have said. Just somebody to do our beckoning for us, someone to take care of us, someone to be our king, please. We'll never have to work again. Jesus will provide meals every day. These are your times to come. And so Jesus knew that wasn't the purpose of why he had come. He was obviously, his work was being very misunderstood by some. And so he took matters into his own hands. He commanded the disciples to head out in a boat while he dismissed the crowd. Matthew 14:22, immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. Let's move on to the next point. Jesus knows about stress when you're alone. He knows about stress when you're alone. I think he had a hard time getting his disciples to leave. This was a group that was strongly coming to Jesus. The Bible very clearly said trying to force Jesus to be king. I mean, these were people with very strong wills that are pushing on him and demanding that he be something. And it was kind of an unruly time. It could have been a very dangerous time for Jesus and all of them. In a lot of ways that we don't have time to discuss right now. But he made his disciples leave, but I think they were hesitant about leaving. I mean, do you want to leave your master in the middle of a bad situation? Not hardly. So I think they had a hard time. But Jesus was that insistent. His tone was that insistent. And then he dismissed this crowd and slipped away and climbed a mountain. Again, the force of Jesus when he needed to be that way was exactly what was needed. Matthew 14:23, after he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. Thinking about this day Jesus has had to this point, and then he had to be alone. I mean, sometimes when you're hurt, some of you like to be alone for a while. But a lot of people, certainly that's not what they want to be at all. Some things are much harder to deal with alone. It's easier to make them bigger and to not have anyone to bounce things off of. But Jesus was alone. After all the day, the death of John the Baptist, being misunderstood, frustrated, excited about what his disciples were saying, people pushing their agendas on him, feeling all the tension and stress of all of that, trying to get the disciples to leave because he needed them to, trying to get rid of this crowd so he could go up and start to deal with what he was dealing with. And then on top of that, he was alone. I think it's significant when you think that Matthew points it out twice in this verse. He says here he went up on the mountainside by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. You've had times when you're lonely, times when you were by yourself and you didn't really want to be, times you had no choice. I think those are tough times for us. Loneliness is a difficult thing to deal with. And I think sometimes we bypass and we really don't appreciate the times when Jesus was fully experiencing his humanity. That the things that we feel in the midst of things similar to this, and not like he did, but in our own ways, affects him like it does us. The same stress is felt. And sometimes we think, well, he's Jesus, and he probably had, some kind of great resources to deal with everything, and he probably didn't feel any of this stuff the way I do when I'm in the middle of this. Like he doesn't feel like I do when I'm grieving, or he doesn't feel like I do when I'm misunderstood, or he doesn't feel like I do when I'm frustrated, or he doesn't feel like I do when I'm lonely. And I think when we do that, we take away some of the biblical teaching on the humanity of Jesus. Because he does know. He does understand. And he was away from his closest friends when he was hurting. And the devil was pulling on him during this time. I'm sure he's reminding him that his death is imminent. John's dead now. You're next. I gave you that shortcut way back there in the wilderness and you didn't take it. You want to reconsider? Those people don't understand you. They don't really want to be led by you. They just want you to do something for them. That's all you're good for. That's all they want from you. They just want to make you their king so you can feed them and take care of all their enemies and heal their sick. That's all they want. You sure that's what you want to go through with this? I think it was a hard night for him. Someone described that watch in the night was another Gethsemane for Jesus. And that his period of prayer, as we look at this, lasted for 8 hours. Ever spent 8 hours in prayer? The Bible says that he climbed the mountain at sunset and he rejoined the disciples in the fourth watch. That's between 3 and 6 a.m. So we're looking at an evening of a lot of praying. Because Jesus knows what lonely feels like. Lastly on your outline, Jesus used several stress coping measures. I just want to pull out 3 here for you this morning. I think Jesus knew the importance of stepping out of the stress from time to time to pray to God. Luke 5:16 says, but Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. And basically lonely places is just saying where there weren't a lot of other people around, there weren't any people around. He simply needed to get away and spend the time with his Father. And I don't think he just went off and clasped his hands and went through some memorized prayers. I really think Jesus was praying like the book of Psalms. Because he was pouring out his heart to God about his distresses, his stresses, lack of belief. I think he just poured out his heart. And God recharged his spiritual batteries. I know what Satan tells us in those times. He tells us it isn't going to do any good. Don't spend your time doing that. It ain't going to do any good. And a lot of times we listen to that. But you probably, like me, have had those times when you actually did that before God and you were amazingly refreshed, or your perspective was changed. And you needed that so badly, but Satan will always say, you don't have time for this. Go do, plug in the, answer. But the thing to do is to go to God and to take all of these stresses to Him. But often there's stresses brought by people, and you just got to get off by yourself. The second thing we see in this passage and some of the other Gospels that relate the same event was that Jesus said no when it was appropriate. He said no when it was appropriate. Now, some people say no to everything, and that's not what we're talking about here. But some of us have trouble saying no. We don't like to displease people. We don't, look like we don't care. We don't want to, there's all those things that we think about when somebody brings something to us that they want us to do. And great, some things we just have to realize aren't within our ability to do currently, or they're not, meeting in, a direction or purpose that you're involved in at the time. Maybe it's a good thing, but it's just not a good time for you. And those things are important, and I think Jesus kind of models that for us in John 6:15. When Jesus saw that they were ready to force him to be their king, he slipped away into the hills by himself. And basically they're saying, Jesus, we want you to come be our king. And Jesus basically says, no, not that kind of king. No, thank you. And, there's just times to say no. There's times when you simply need to say, no, my schedule's too full. No, this does not meet, where I'm headed at the moment. There's other people that would be better suited for this. No. And so we see Jesus modeling that for us here in the midst of stress. It's all right at times when it's appropriate to say no. The third thing, Jesus surrounded himself with other believers. Jesus surrounded himself with other believers. Now, going to God is certainly important. That's something we need to do. But there's times as well that Jesus understood the intimate necessity of being around other God-fearing people and let them minister with you and to you. Mark 6:30 and 31, the apostles returned to Jesus from their ministry tour and told him all that they had done and taught. Then Jesus said, let's go off by ourselves to a quiet place and rest a while. He said this because there were so many people coming and going that Jesus and his apostles didn't even have time to eat. So that boat trip was probably very, very helpful, even though it wasn't probably long enough. Probably wasn't everything that Jesus may have hoped for in that evening, but it was very ministering to he and his followers. So there's just times that we are refreshed by being around others of God's people, and we need that. We need that so much. Let's pray this morning.